As Marcus Washington pulled up to the grand entrance of the luxury hotel, he couldn't help but admire the sleek, black sedan he drove every day. The engine purred quietly as he stepped out, glancing at his phone for a quick weather update while waiting for his passenger. Marcus had been a chauffeur for years, working hard to build a reputation of professionalism and respect. His latest client, Peter Carlisle, was the CEO of a major tech company. Marcus had been driving him for nearly 6 months, long enough to know the man's habits. Carlisle was sharp, well-dressed, and always moving. To the public, he was a polished figure of success, admired for his business acumen. The door of the hotel swung open, and Carlisle strutted out, as usual, talking loudly into his phone. Marcus straightened his posture, opening the back door for the CEO without missing a beat. Carlisle nodded in acknowledgement, but he was deep in conversation, too absorbed to give much else in the way of thanks. Marcus slid back into the driver's seat, pulling away from the curb with practiced ease as the sounds of the city faded into the background. The ride was silent at first, aside from the muffled voice of Carlisle in the back. He was speaking rapidly, his voice confident but laced with frustration. Marcus knew better than to listen too closely, focusing on the road ahead, but certain words drifted into his consciousness, uninvited. "Funding's tight, but I don't care. Fire them all if you have to." Marcus caught sight of Carlisle's reflection in the rearview mirror. His face was tense, his free hand gesturing as if the person on the other end of the call could see it. Marcus tried to tune it out, reminding himself it wasn't his business. His job was to get Carlisle to his destination, nothing more. But then the conversation took a turn that Marcus hadn't expected. Carlisle's voice dropped lower, and his words grew sharper. "No, I'm telling you, it's not just the layoffs. These people, they're a problem. I'm sick of tiptoeing around, especially that group. You know the ones I mean. Always playing the victim card. Let me tell you, it's no coincidence we're seeing the worst performance out of them." Marcus stiffened, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. He wasn't sure if Carlisle was talking about employees or clients, but the implication was clear. The group Carlisle was referring to wasn't just some vague category. Marcus could feel it, the ugly weight behind those words. Carlisle didn't stop. "Honestly, I've been too lenient. If I had my way, I'd clean house. The truth is, some people just aren't cut out for this kind of work. You know what I mean? You give them a chance, and they throw it back in your face." Marcus felt his stomach churn. He had encountered racism before, but hearing it come from someone so high up, someone he had worked for, made it sting in a different way. Carlisle's voice oozed entitlement, and Marcus suddenly felt exposed, like an unwitting spectator to a conversation he should have been shielded from. He tried to keep his focus on driving, but the words lingered, pushing through the walls of professionalism he had built over the years. Then Carlisle said something that pushed Marcus over the edge. "The truth is, they don't belong in our world. They'll never catch up, no matter how much we lower the bar for them. It's a joke, really. If they spent half the time working as they do complaining about being oppressed, maybe they'd get somewhere." Marcus's heart raced. Carlisle's words weren't just offensive. They were toxic, dripping with a racism that was all too familiar. The kind of racism that didn't scream or shout, but whispered behind closed doors, insidious and calculating. Marcus's mind raced. Should he say something? Should he just keep driving? Every part of him wanted to lash out, to tell Carlisle exactly what he thought of him, but he couldn't afford that luxury. Not here. Not now. What Carlisle didn't know, though, was that Marcus's phone had been recording the entire conversation. An unintended consequence of an earlier phone call Marcus had made before Carlisle got in the car. The phone was still in the cup holder, silently capturing every word. As the realization hit, Marcus's chest tightened. He didn't plan on recording anything, but now it was all there. Carlisle's venomous words, his real thoughts. The weight of the decision pressed on Marcus. What would he do with this information? Could he even use it? Carlisle was powerful, connected. People like him didn't fall easily. But the thought of staying silent made Marcus feel complicit, like he was somehow endorsing Carlisle's views by not speaking out. The ride continued in strained silence. Carlisle eventually ended his call, oblivious to the tension in the front seat. He casually scrolled through his phone, his mind likely far from the gravity of the words he had just spoken. Marcus kept driving, his thoughts swirling in a storm of anger and frustration. By the time they reached the destination, Marcus had made up his mind. As he pulled up to the building, he opened the door for Carlyle like he always did. Carlyle gave him a brief nod, not even bothering to make eye contact before striding toward the entrance. Marcus's pulse quickened. He knew what he had to do. He wouldn't be able to live with himself if he just let it go. As Carlyle disappeared into the building, Marcus took a deep breath and pulled out his phone. The audio file sat there, the timestamp marking it as undeniable proof of what had just happened. He had options. Marcus wasn't naive. He knew the risks. Carlyle's influence was vast, and going up against him could cost Marcus's livelihood, maybe even more. But the truth weighed heavier than the fear. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, belittled, or dismissed because of their skin color. It was about standing up, even when it felt like the whole world would push back. Over the next few days, Marcus reached out to trusted friends, people who could guide him through what was about to come. They listened to the recording, their faces hardening with every word. "You need to get this out there," one of them said, their voice firm with conviction. Marcus nodded. He had already decided. The world needed to hear what Peter Carlyle was really like. The process was swift. Within days, the recording made its way to a prominent journalist who had built a reputation for exposing corporate misconduct. The journalist promised to protect Marcus's identity as much as possible, but Marcus knew there would be consequences. The truth had a way of cutting through even the most carefully constructed facades, and Carlyle's would be no different. When the story broke, it was explosive. Headlines splashed across news outlets, the recording playing on every major network. Carlyle's face, once a symbol of corporate success, became synonymous with disgrace. His company tried to control the damage, releasing hollow statements about diversity and zero tolerance for racism, but it was too late. The damage was done. Shareholders began pulling out, and calls for Carlyle's resignation flooded in. For Marcus, the aftermath was a whirlwind. The public didn't know it was him who had exposed Carlyle, but within certain circles, word spread quickly. Some people called him a hero, others warned that he'd never work in the industry again. But Marcus felt something he hadn't in a long time: pride. He had stood up for what was right, even when it terrified him. And though Carlyle's downfall was swift, Marcus knew the battle wasn't over. Racism ran deep, far deeper than just one man's words. But this was a start. It was a reminder that silence was never the answer, and that sometimes it took just one voice to make a change. As Marcus drove his car through the city streets, he felt lighter. The world was still the same in many ways, but something had shifted. People were talking, listening, questioning the status quo. And maybe, just maybe, this would lead to more than just the fall of one CEO. It could lead to a reckoning, one that was long overdue. Marcus had no regrets. He had done what he knew and his heart was right. And that, he realized, was all that mattered. As the media storm around Peter Carlyle raged on, Marcus found himself navigating a whirlwind of emotions. There was a sense of vindication in watching the mighty CEO fall, but the reality of what he had done weighed heavily on him. Even though he had remained anonymous in the public eye, Marcus knew that those in his professional circle were well aware of who had leaked the recording. Whispers and rumors began to circulate, and the glances from his colleagues, once friendly and warm, turned cautious, even distant. One morning, as Marcus sat in a small cafe near his apartment, he noticed a familiar face on the TV mounted to the wall. Peter Carlyle was being interviewed. Despite the fallout, the man hadn't completely disappeared from the public eye. He was dressed immaculately, as always, but his expression was somber, his tone measured. The interviewer was pressing him about the racist comments that had been caught on tape. Carlyle didn't deny them, but his responses were filled with the kind of corporate doublespeak Marcus had come to expect from someone like him. "It was a mistake," Carlyle said, his voice steady. "I deeply regret the hurt my words caused. They don't reflect who I am or what I believe. I've spent my life working to build opportunities for people of all backgrounds, and this moment, it was a lapse in judgment. A terrible lapse." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. A lapse in judgment? That's what Carlyle was calling it. The casual racism, the entitlement, the dehumanizing comments, they weren't a momentary slip-up. They were a glimpse into the man's true character, the beliefs he carried behind his polished exterior. And now, here he was, sitting in front of millions of viewers, spinning his apology into a carefully crafted narrative of redemption. The interviewer wasn't letting him off the hook that easily, though. But Mr. Carlyle, this wasn't just an offhand comment. You were recorded making several derogatory remarks about a group of people over the course of a conversation. How do you respond to those who say this wasn't an isolated incident, but rather a reflection of deeper biases? Carlyle's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. I understand why people feel that way, but I've taken steps to educate myself, to listen and learn. I've spent the last few weeks reflecting on my actions, and I'm committed to making amends. I've reached out to several organizations that focus on racial equality, and I plan to work with them moving forward. I'm determined to be part of the solution. Marcus scoffed quietly as he watched. It was the same old story. Powerful men like Carlyle could always buy their way back into public favor. A few charitable donations, some public statements about education and reflection, and the world would eventually move on. Carlyle would rebrand himself, and before long, he'd be back in boardrooms, shaking hands with other executives who were all too willing to forgive and forget. As Marcus left the cafe, his mind raced with thoughts of how deep the problem went. Carlyle wasn't unique. He was just one of the many who harbored these views behind closed doors. And for every Carlyle exposed, how many more were out there, unchecked and unchallenged? Over the next few weeks, Marcus kept a low profile. He wasn't sure what the future held for him. His employer hadn't fired him outright, but the tension was palpable. He sensed they were waiting for the media frenzy to die down before making a decision. It was only a matter of time before he'd need to figure out his next move. One afternoon, while Marcus was running errands, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Curious, he opened it. I know it was you who recorded Carlyle. Meet me at the park. We need to talk. His heart skipped a beat. The text was vague, but the implications were clear. Someone new. Marcus's first instinct was to ignore it, to block the number and pretend he hadn't seen the message. But something about the tone intrigued him. Whoever had sent it didn't sound angry or threatening, just determined. Against his better judgment, Marcus decided to go. He arrived at the park at dusk, scanning the area nervously. There weren't many people around, just a few joggers and dog walkers. Then, he saw a figure sitting on a bench near the fountain. A man in a crisp suit, wearing dark sunglasses. Marcus approached cautiously. You're the one who texted me? The man looked up and nodded, gesturing for Marcus to sit. I'm not here to threaten you, if that's what you're worried about. Marcus sat down, his muscles tense. Then what do you want? The man removed his sunglasses, revealing sharp, calculating eyes. I represent a group of people who are very interested in what you did. Exposing Carlyle was no small feat. You've stirred up something bigger than you realize. Marcus raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? We've been watching Carlyle's rise for a while now. He's not the only one operating in the shadows. There are others, CEOs, politicians, people in power, who share his views. They think they're untouchable, hidden behind their wealth and influence. But we're working to change that. Marcus leaned back slightly, his mind racing. Who exactly are you? Think of us as a coalition, the man said, his voice calm and measured. We're not just about taking down one man. We're about systemic change. Carlyle was just the beginning, and we need people like you. People with the courage to stand up and expose the truth. Marcus felt a surge of uncertainty. He hadn't set out to join any kind of movement. He had just wanted to do the right thing. What do you expect me to do? The man smiled faintly. For now, nothing. You've already done more than enough. But if you're interested in going further, in helping us root out more corruption, more injustice, we could use your help. Marcus thought about it, the weight of the offer pressing down on him. He had never imagined himself as part of some grand cause, but the thought of exposing more people like Carlyle, of being part of something bigger than himself, it was tempting. I'll think about it, Marcus said, standing up. The man nodded, slipping his sunglasses back on. Take your time, but just know, there's always more to be done. When you're ready, we'll be here. As Marcus walked away, the weight of the decision lingered in the back of his mind. He had already taken one step into a world he hadn't anticipated, and now there was no telling where it would lead. As Marcus walked away from the park, his mind buzzed with questions. Who exactly was this group? What kind of corruption were they talking about, and how deep did it run? His gut instinct was to back away, to avoid getting pulled into something that could jeopardize his already fragile situation. But the temptation lingered, gnawing at the edge of his thoughts. The idea that he could do more, expose more, make a real difference, it was hard to shake. A few days passed, and Marcus tried to carry on as normal. He drove his clients, kept his head down, and avoided any unnecessary conversations. But he couldn't escape the growing sense that something bigger was happening behind the scenes. Carlyle was still in the news, though the frenzy was starting to die down. The company had announced a temporary leave of absence for the CEO, citing personal reasons, but the damage was already done. Stocks had plummeted, investors were distancing themselves, and there was talk of a takeover bid. One afternoon, while Marcus was scrolling through his phone in his car between jobs, a notification popped up. An email, subject line, "A message for you." Hesitant, Marcus opened it. Inside was a single sentence. "The next one's closer than you think." Beneath it, an attachment, an audio file. Marcus's heart raced as he stared at the email. He hesitated for a moment before pressing play. The file crackled to life, and a voice he didn't recognize filled the car. It was grainy, like a secret recording. And it wasn't just any conversation. It was another executive, someone Marcus had driven just a few weeks ago, talking openly about discriminatory hiring practices, about using racial biases to make key business decisions. The voice dripped with arrogance and entitlement, as though these kinds of comments were nothing more than shop talk. Marcus felt his stomach churn. He recognized the name, a man who worked closely with Peter Carlyle. The implications were clear. This was another one of them. Another powerful figure who thought he was invincible. And somehow, Marcus had been sent the proof. His first instinct was to delete the email. This was getting too dangerous. He didn't want to get involved. But as his thumb hovered over the delete button, a thought crossed his mind. This was why he had recorded Carlyle in the first place, wasn't it? To expose people like him? To shed light on the things that others tried to keep hidden? Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, weighing his options. If he shared this, he knew there would be consequences. But if he stayed silent, he would be turning a blind eye to the very thing he had been trying to fight. Taking a deep breath, he hit reply. "Who are you, and why are you sending me this?" He waited anxiously for a response. Minutes passed, then an hour. Just as he was about to give up, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a simple text. "You know why. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Marcus swallowed hard. He didn't know why. He had been pulled into something larger than himself, and now there was no turning back. But how far was he willing to go? He knew that if he released this new recording, it wouldn't just be another scandal. It would be a signal, a declaration that people like Carlyle and his circle weren't untouchable. That night, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, staring at his laptop screen. The recording played on loop, the man's words echoing in the small room. He had to make a choice. He could either keep quiet, stay in his lane, and try to get back to a normal life. Or he could release the audio, knowing full well that it would make waves, maybe even bigger than the ones Carlyle's downfall had caused. The phone rang, breaking Marcus's concentration. He picked it up, his heart pounding. The caller ID was blocked. "Hello?" Marcus answered, his voice tense. A pause, then a familiar voice. It was the man from the park. "You've heard the recording, haven't you?" Marcus felt his throat tighten. "Yeah, I heard it. This is your moment, Marcus. You can do what's right, or you can let these people keep running the world. The choice is yours." Marcus clenched his fist, frustration boiling beneath the surface. "Why me? Why are you putting all this on me?" "Because you're the one who can make a difference," the man replied, his tone calm but insistent. "You've already proven that you're willing to stand up for what's right. This is just the next step." Marcus was silent for a moment, weighing his words. "And what happens to me if I do this? I've already got enough people looking at me sideways. My job's on the line. What's stopping them from coming after me? We can protect you, the man said confidently. You're not alone in this. There are more of us than you think. And we're watching. The call ended abruptly, leaving Marcus staring at his phone in stunned silence. Protect him? Who exactly were these people? And how did they have so much information? The next morning, Marcus drove to work, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that every move he made was being scrutinized. But at the same time, a strange sense of clarity settled over him. This was his chance to make a real difference, to stand up against the kind of injustice that so often went unchallenged. But Marcus knew the risks, and as he sat behind the wheel, waiting for his next client, he realized that this decision would change everything. As Marcus sat in his car, the weight of everything he had been pulled into felt overwhelming. He gripped the steering wheel, staring blankly ahead, while the city moved around him. People rushing to their jobs, cars honking, and the distant hum of daily life continuing as if nothing had changed. But for him, everything had shifted. His phone buzzed again. It was a reminder of the decision hanging over his head, the message from that mysterious group still lingering in his mind. Could he trust them? And even if he did, what would happen next? His life had already been turned upside down after the Carlisle recording. Another scandal, even bigger than the first, would leave no going back. Marcus sighed and checked his schedule. A pickup at a corporate office downtown in 20 minutes. Nothing unusual. He figured he could use the distraction, something to take his mind off everything, at least for a little while. As he navigated through the city streets, he felt a growing sense of unease that had nothing to do with the traffic. He pulled up to the address, a towering glass building that looked like every other corporate high-rise in the city. Marcus checked his mirror as the doors opened, and a middle-aged man in a tailored suit stepped out, accompanied by two younger assistants. The man had the unmistakable look of someone important, confident, powerful, and slightly irritated by the trivial tasks of everyday life. As the man approached, Marcus realized with a sinking feeling that he recognized him. It was James Warwick, the very executive whose voice had been captured in the new recording. The man who had bragged about rigging the system against minorities, and who had seemed so untouchable during that phone call. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Of all the people to pick up today, it had to be him. Warwick slid into the back seat, barely acknowledging Marcus with a curt nod as he settled into a phone call, barking orders at someone on the other end of the line. Marcus's mind raced. He tried to focus on driving, but all he could think about was the conversation he had listened to over and over again. The arrogance, the casual racism. It was all there, sitting in his back seat, just a few feet away. Warwick continued his call, oblivious to the turmoil brewing in Marcus's head. "I don't care how it gets done," Warwick said, his voice cutting through the tension in the car. "We need those contracts signed by the end of the week, and if they don't comply, we'll find someone else who will. Just make it happen." Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter, resisting the urge to say something, anything. How many other people like Warwick were out there, casually making decisions that affected people's lives without a second thought? And here he was, driving him around like nothing had changed, like he hadn't just been handed the evidence of Warwick's corruption on a silver platter. His phone buzzed in the cup holder. A new text? "He's right in front of you. Do you see it now?" Marcus's heart skipped a beat. Whoever this group was, they knew exactly what was happening. He glanced at the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of Warwick tapping away on his phone, completely unaware of the growing storm. Another text followed. "You know what to do." Marcus swallowed hard. He didn't know what to do, but the risks were greater now. If he exposed Warwick, there was no guarantee that he'd be safe from the fallout. He'd be burning more than just bridges. He'd be putting himself directly in the line of fire. Yet, if he did nothing, he'd be letting people like Warwick continue unchecked, spreading their poison without consequence. Warwick's phone rang again, pulling Marcus from his thoughts. "Yes, it's James," he said, his voice smooth and commanding. "What's the latest on Carlisle? I heard the board is close to finalizing the deal." Marcus's ears perked up. Carlisle. Of course, Warwick was involved. The whole system was interconnected. One powerful man protecting another, all working behind the scenes to ensure their continued dominance. The sickening realization hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. As the drive continued, Marcus's internal battle grew more intense. Every word out of Warwick's mouth was a reminder of why this man needed to be exposed. But how? Could he release the recording and stay anonymous again? Would it even matter, now that they were already watching him? When they arrived at Warwick's destination, the executive barely acknowledged Marcus as he exited the car, barking final orders to his assistants. Marcus watched him walk away, the weight of the decision still pressing down on him. As the door closed behind him, Marcus leaned back in his seat, exhaling shakily. His phone buzzed once more. Well? Marcus stared at the message, his mind swirling. He wanted to do the right thing, but how could he be sure it wouldn't destroy everything he had left? Before he could think too much, another text came through. This time, it was different. If you don't act, others will suffer. It's your move. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the pressure mount. His next decision would change everything. As Marcus sat in the driver's seat, his pulse racing, he glanced down at the message on his phone. It's your move. The words felt like a challenge, an invisible hand pushing him further into a corner. The weight of it all bore down on him, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. Everything in his life had led to this. Every instance where he'd been brushed aside, overlooked, where people like Warwick and Carlyle had made decisions that shaped the lives of people like him without a second thought. Now he had the power to flip the script, but the consequences were terrifying. His mind replayed Warwick's voice from the back seat, the casual cruelty, the blatant disregard for others. Marcus knew he couldn't just let it go. But how could he release this new information without painting a target on his own back? He wasn't a whistleblower by nature. He was just a guy trying to get by, to take care of his family. But now, it felt like the universe was demanding more of him. His phone buzzed again, snapping him out of his thoughts. Another text. Tick-tock. Marcus gritted his teeth. Whoever these people were, they weren't giving him much time. He wasn't even sure if he could trust them, but they seemed to know everything about his life, his moves, even his thoughts. The paranoia was creeping in, but at the same time, he knew they were right. Warwick was part of a larger, darker system, one that needed to be taken down, piece by piece. He sighed, his hands trembling slightly as he started the engine. He had another client to pick up soon, but his mind was far from the routine. As he pulled into the traffic, the buildings blurred into the background, his focus inward. What was his next move? He couldn't just wait for something to happen. He had to take control of the situation. But how? A plan started forming in his mind, one he hadn't thought through completely but felt compelled to follow. He could release the recording anonymously, again, and let it spread like wildfire. This time, though, he'd make sure the evidence reached not just the media but the authorities. He wasn't naive. He knew many of them were just as corrupt. But this recording, coupled with Carlyle's downfall, might create enough pressure to crack things open. He could let the story take on a life of its own, let the weight of public opinion and media scrutiny do the work for him. Marcus pulled over for a moment, needing to clear his head. He opened his phone and scrolled to the audio file, his thumb hovering over the share button. Just one tap, and it could all be out there. His mind raced as he envisioned the fallout. Warwick's downfall would send shockwaves through the company, and the public outrage would be unavoidable. But what if they traced it back to him? What if this anonymous group's promise of protection was nothing but smoke? He was about to put the phone down when another text appeared. Still waiting. Or should we? Marcus stared at the message. They were getting impatient, pushing him toward action. And then something occurred to him. What if this wasn't just about Warwick or Carlyle? What if these people had their own agenda, their own motives? He had to be careful, but he couldn't back out now. He'd come too far, seen too much. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on his window. Marcus jumped, startled, and quickly rolled down the glass. A man in a suit stood there, leaning in slightly. "Mr. Taylor?" the man asked, his tone friendly but formal. "Yeah, that's me," Marcus replied, his voice unsteady as he tried to mask his tension. The man handed him an envelope. "You've been served." Marcus froze, staring at the envelope in his hand. Before he could say anything, the man was gone, disappearing into the crowd. His stomach twisted as he ripped open the envelope, revealing a lawsuit. It was from Warwick's legal team, accusing him of defamation, of illegally recording private conversations. Marcus's heart sank. They knew. Somehow, they had figured it out. The walls were closing in, and he hadn't even made his move yet. As he sat there, stunned and trying to process what had just happened, his phone buzzed again. This time, the message was short and simple. "They're coming for you. Make it count." Marcus felt the panic rising. He was running out of time, running out of options. But deep down, he knew what he had to do. He couldn't let fear stop him. The truth needed to come out, no matter the cost. With shaky hands, Marcus opened the email app on his phone and attached the audio file. His fingers hovered over the send button, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no turning back now. If he pressed that button, he was committing himself to whatever storm came next. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and hit send. The moment Marcus hit send, his heart raced even faster, as if every beat was a countdown to what came next. The email was gone, out in the world, no longer in his control. His hands still trembled, and he stared at the screen, watching as the message disappeared from his outbox, leaving behind an empty, eerie silence. The weight of what he had just done settled over him like a heavy fog. There was no undoing it now. He glanced in the rearview mirror, checking his surroundings, half expecting someone to approach the car. But everything outside seemed normal, people walking, cars passing by. The lawsuit in his lap felt like a ticking bomb, one that had just started its countdown. Warwick's people were onto him, and the anonymous group, whoever they were, had played their part in pushing him into this corner. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was just a pawn in a much larger game. His phone buzzed again. He flinched, almost reluctant to check it. Another message. "Good move. Now get ready." Get ready for what? Marcus thought. What was he even prepared for? The walls felt like they were closing in, and every possible exit seemed blocked. His mind spun with questions. Who were these people? How did they know so much? And what was their endgame? He put the car back in gear, driving aimlessly through the city, trying to piece together his next steps. He knew one thing for sure. Warwick wasn't going to go down quietly. And if Warwick had enough power to get legal documents to him this fast, there was no telling what else he was capable of. As Marcus drove, he kept glancing at the phone, waiting for something to happen. The minutes passed, feeling like hours. Then, without warning, a breaking news alert flashed on his screen. His breath caught in his throat as he tapped on the notification. The headline hit him like a punch to the gut. Leaked audio implicates CEO James Warwick in racial discrimination scandal. It was out there. The story was spreading, faster than he had imagined. His heart raced as he read the article, which had already gained traction with multiple news outlets. Reporters were dissecting the audio, playing Warwick's damning words on repeat. The backlash was immediate, with social media erupting in outrage, calling for Warwick to resign, for justice to be served. Marcus should have felt a sense of victory. He had exposed the truth, but instead, he felt a cold dread creeping in. He knew this wasn't over, far from it. Warwick's downfall was just the beginning, and Marcus was now a key player in a game he hadn't even wanted to join. Another text buzzed through. "Well done. Stay low. They'll come after you." His heart sank. He knew it was true. Warwick's people would be furious, scrambling to control the damage, and Marcus would be their first target. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. As the day wore on, the scandal exploded. News channels picked up the story, talking heads debated the implications, and social media was ablaze with hashtags calling for justice. It was a media firestorm, the kind that destroyed careers, took down empires. Warwick's name was everywhere, his face plastered across the screen, but Marcus couldn't enjoy any of it. His phone kept buzzing, notifications flooding in, some from the mysterious group, others from unknown numbers. Threats, warnings, and praise all mixed together in a chaotic stream. He needed to think, to figure out his next move before Warwick's people closed in. The reality of his situation hit him hard. He was no longer just a chauffeur who had overheard something he shouldn't have. He was now a whistleblower, the one who had lit the fuse on a scandal that could shake the corporate world to its core. He pulled over again, parking the car on a quiet side street. His phone buzzed once more, and this time it wasn't a text. It was a call from an unknown number. His heart pounded as he debated whether to answer. Could it be Warwick's lawyers? The press? Or worse, someone looking to silence him? After a moment of hesitation, he answered, his voice shaky. Hello? Marcus, a deep, calm voice said on the other end. You've done well. But it's not over yet. Who is this? Marcus asked, his pulse quickening. You don't need to know my name, the voice replied, cool and detached. Just know that we're watching. Warwick isn't the only one with skeletons in his closet. There are more, and you've only scratched the surface. Marcus's grip tightened on the phone. What do you mean? There are others like him, the voice continued. More powerful, more dangerous. And if you thought Warwick was bad, you haven't seen anything yet. Marcus's mind reeled. How deep did this go? What had he gotten himself into? Stay alert, the voice said before the call abruptly ended, leaving Marcus sitting in stunned silence. He stared at his phone, the words echoing in his mind. More powerful, more dangerous. Suddenly, the enormity of what he had stepped into felt overwhelming. He wasn't just up against Warwick. There was something bigger, darker at play, and he was now a part of it, whether he liked it or not. His phone buzzed again, but this time it was a call from someone familiar. His wife, Marcus answered, and her worried voice filled his ear. Marcus, what's going on? I've been hearing things. People are talking. Marcus exhaled slowly, his voice thick with exhaustion. I'll explain everything when I get home. Just stay safe. As he hung up, he realized he wasn't sure how to explain any of it. His life had become a whirlwind of uncertainty, and now, the only thing he could do was brace himself for what was coming next. The storm was just beginning. Marcus sat there in the car, his thoughts swirling in a chaotic mess. The streets outside seemed calm, but inside him, a storm raged. He couldn't stop replaying the voice on the phone. More powerful, more dangerous. What had he started? His phone vibrated again, making his heart jump. This time, it was a message from his wife. Please come home. We need to talk. The words felt heavier than usual. Marcus hadn't even told her what was happening, but somehow, she knew something was off. He needed to get to her, to explain. But before he could even think about leaving, another notification flashed across his screen. This one from the news. Warwick had been placed on indefinite leave, while the board reviewed the allegations. Marcus stared at the headline. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. He knew how these things worked. Indefinite leave was just corporate speak for damage control. Warwick would lay low for a while, wait for the outrage to die down, and come back like nothing ever happened. Marcus clenched his fists. The system always found a way to protect people like Warwick. His phone buzzed again, breaking his thoughts. Another text, but this time it wasn't from the anonymous group or his wife. It was from an old friend, someone he hadn't spoken to in months. Hey, saw the news. Call me. Marcus hesitated. Keith, a lawyer he'd known from back in the day, before life pulled them in different directions. Keith had always been the type to take on cases no one else wanted. Maybe, just maybe he could help. Marcus dialed his number, his nerves fraying as the phone rang. Keith picked up on the second ring. Marcus? Man, it's been a while. What's going on? You in the middle of this Warwick thing? Yeah, Marcus replied, his voice unsteady. I'm the one who leaked the audio. There was a pause on the other end. Marcus could hear Keith's sharp intake of breath. Damn, Keith finally said. You're playing with fire, Marcus. You know that, right? I know, Marcus replied, but I didn't have a choice. Keith sighed. You always have a choice, man. But now that you've done it, you've got to be smart. These people don't play fair. Marcus leaned back in his seat, running a hand over his face. I don't know what to do. I've got Warwick's lawyers coming after me, and some mysterious group is feeding me information, but I don't even know who they are. Keith's voice was firm. First thing, don't trust anyone you don't know. That group? They could be using you for their own agenda. And as for Warwick's lawyers, you need to get ahead of this. If they're suing you for defamation, they're going to try and bleed you dry. Marcus groaned, the weight of everything pressing down harder. What should I do? Lay low, Keith advised. Stay out of the spotlight for now. But you need legal representation, man. If they're serious about this lawsuit, you can't fight it alone. I'll make some calls, see what I can do. Thanks, Keith, Marcus said, his voice heavy with relief. I owe you one. You owe me more than one after this, Keith said, but there was a hint of humor in his voice. Just be careful, Marcus. These kinds of cases don't always end well. After hanging up, Marcus felt a little better, but not much. His life had spiraled into something he couldn't control, and while Keith's advice was solid, it didn't change the fact that he was being hunted from all sides. As he pulled away from the curb and headed toward home, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every car that passed, every pedestrian on the sidewalk felt like a threat. He was paranoid, sure, but after everything that had happened, he couldn't afford to let his guard down. When he finally pulled into his driveway, his wife, Tanya, was standing by the front door, her arms crossed, eyes full of concern. Marcus stepped out of the car, feeling the weight of her gaze. "You gonna tell me what's going on now?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. Marcus walked up to her, took a deep breath and said, "Let's go inside." They sat at the kitchen table, the silence between them thick. Marcus didn't know where to begin, how to explain the whirlwind of chaos that had consumed his life over the past few days. He could see the questions in Tanya's eyes, but she waited, giving him the space to find the words. "I overheard something at work," Marcus finally said. "Something bad. Warwick was making these horrible comments, racist stuff, and I recorded it." Tanya's eyes widened. "You recorded it?" "Yeah," Marcus said, his voice quieter now. "I didn't plan to. It just happened. But when I listened to it again, I couldn't just let it go. So, I leaked it." Tanya's face softened, her expression shifting from worry to understanding. "You did the right thing," she said quietly. "But now they're coming after you, aren't they?" Marcus nodded. "Yeah, Warwick's suing me. And there's this group. They're the ones who pushed me to leak it. I don't even know who they are, but they've been pulling strings behind the scenes." Tanya reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "We'll figure this out. You're not alone in this." Marcus squeezed her hand, grateful for her support. But even as he sat there, feeling a moment of peace in her presence, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The forces he had set into motion were bigger than he had ever imagined, and the fallout was far from over. As Marcus sat there, his hand in Tanya's, the weight of what he had set in motion began to settle in his mind. He had uncovered the truth, but now he had to face the consequences. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty. Keith managed to get him some legal protection, though Marcus knew it was only a temporary shield. Warwick's lawyers were relentless, and the media frenzy didn't seem to slow down. Every time he turned on the TV, it was another headline about the scandal. But something else was happening too. As the days went by, more and more people started to speak out. Former employees, people who had worked under Warwick, began sharing their own experiences. The leaked audio had opened the floodgates. What began as one recording was now becoming a movement. The racism that had been lurking in the shadows of Warwick's company was being exposed for all to see. And it wasn't just Warwick. Other executives, people who had allowed this behavior to thrive, were being called out too. It didn't take long before Warwick's empire began to crumble. Shareholders pulled out, major investors distanced themselves, and the board had no choice but to remove Warwick from his position. Marcus watched from the sidelines as the man who had once towered over him fell from grace. And though he should have felt victorious, there was something bittersweet about it all. One afternoon, as Marcus was driving through the city, this time not for work, but just to clear his head, he received a call from Keith. "It's over," Keith said. "Warwick's dropped the lawsuit. He's been blacklisted in every major industry. He's done." Marcus exhaled, the tension finally leaving his body. It was over. But it wasn't just Warwick's downfall that mattered. It was the bigger picture. Racism, the silent undercurrent in so many institutions, had been dragged into the light. Marcus had played his part in that, and now, change was starting to ripple through the industry. Later that night, Marcus sat down with Tanya, a quiet sense of peace between them. They had been through a whirlwind, but they had made it through. "I never wanted to be part of this," Marcus admitted, "but I'm glad I did what I did." "You did the right thing," Tanya said, squeezing his hand. And look at what came from it. You stood up to something wrong, and now things are changing. Marcus nodded, the reality sinking in. He had fought a system that was designed to protect the powerful, and even though he had been afraid, even though he had been targeted, he hadn't backed down. The moral of his journey was clear. Silence in the face of injustice allows the wrong to continue. Standing up, even when it's terrifying, even when it costs you, is the only way to change things. Marcus knew that Warwick wasn't the first, and he wouldn't be the last, but the message had been sent. No one was untouchable. The truth would always find its way to the surface.